Steve Gaynor, what is your favorite game?
My favorite game is Resident Evil 4.
Con alegría, con alegría.
So I've been playing games for literally before I can remember. I had a Commodore 64 in my room when I was a little kid. My dad worked for a phone company, and he thought that it was important that I be familiar with computers from the get-go. So I had a Commodore 64 and was typing in console commands to run games and stuff from before I can remember. And the first stuff that I played was like Sesame Street games, and when I was a little kid I was really into Godzilla movies, and there was an isometric Godzilla game on Commodore 64 that I was really into, and I was lucky to kind of go from there up the ladder of different console generations and PC games, from the NES through 90s PC gaming of the Super Nintendo and PlayStation. So it's kind of been with me the whole time.
Like you mentioned that kind of golden era of 90s PC games. Like what were you playing at that time? Like obviously the obvious would be Doom and all that there.
Sure. I was a Nintendo kid for a good amount of time. For kind of like from when the NES came out up through kind of the late 80s. I really didn't play much in the way of PC games, but they did a version of Maniac Mansion for the NES. And I loved it and was super into it, and it was so different from almost anything else that you could play on the Nintendo. And my next door neighbor, who was like my kind of nerd Sherpa, because he was older than me and into all like the geeky stuff, and he had an SNES before I did and all that kind of stuff. When I was super into Maniac Mansion, he was like, well, if you like that game, my dad has a bunch of other games like that on his computer. And so that was what got me into Sierra games like Space Quest and Quest for Glory. And that got me into other LucasArts games like Monkey Island, and going forward from there. So really, Maniac Mansion being on the NES was my transition into PC gaming at, like you were saying, a really great time, where in the years following that, as I was going through the classic LucasArts adventures, like Sam and Max and kind of take your pick of that era. That was also when Doom and Doom 2 were coming out, and when the classic Origin games like Syndicate and Dungeon Keeper and Crusader No Remorse, and in later years, 97 was when Fallout came out, and Interstate 76. There was just, sort of all of this, in some cases a little bit obscure PC stuff that I was playing, along with the more obvious titles. And that was due to the fact that I had a subscription to PC Gamer magazine when I was that age, and they did a really great job of highlighting some games that were, awesome experiences that may have been a little bit harder to pick out on the game store shelves otherwise. So I felt lucky to have a view into a lot of interesting stuff at that time.
So basically, your tastes at that time were mostly around point and click stuff, basically.
Um, I mean, I feel like I had a pretty good range. I mean, at the time, I played Diablo and I played, Warcraft, and I played, kind of like a pretty, I played MechWarrior 2. There was a pretty broad uh, range of stuff that I was exposed to. But I think that, kind of unsurprisingly, based on what I've worked on, the stuff that stuck with me most was, yeah, point and click story based adventure games and more kind of immersive first person games like System Shock and Thief and Deus Ex and System Shock 2. And, in a lot of ways, the stuff I've worked on speaks most directly to those kind of immersive first person experiences and something that is more in the nonviolent kind of adventure story and character driven experience, and bringing those two things together.
So with that in mind, like, how did you kind of first wander into the path of the games industry? Like, how did you first start out?
Well, I was in college, and I'd been going through the art program, because I had always drawn and made comics and stuff like that, and so I was kind of on this path of getting a degree in the visual arts with a minor in art history, and I ended up getting a sculpture degree because I had always worked in 2D and I wanted to learn more about working in a three-dimensional space. Because partway through college, I just realized that, like, I don't want to, I think, be a working visual artist as my vocation, but I also started realizing at that point that video games were the thing that really spoke to me and stuck with me, and that I thought about more than any other form of kind of entertainment or media. I was like making comics and drawing, but then realizing that what I really cared about wasn't like comics as a medium so much as, I would be thinking about games. I would be thinking about the potential for game, design ideas and stuff. So I basically realized I needed to finish out my college degree and then figure out how to get in the games industry. So I moved down to San Francisco after I got my college degree. My girlfriend at the time, who we're now married, was going to grad school in San Francisco. And so I moved down there, and my first game job was as a contract QA tester at Sony, testing PlayStation 2 and PSP games for certification to be released.
And like going on from there, what can you talk about what games you were certain at the time, or is that NDA'd?
Oh no, that's perfectly fine. I mean, I didn't work on a lot of stuff that was very prominent at the time. The thing about certification testing is, any game that's going to come out has to go through cert, which is what's interesting, I think, about working in cert is you catch a bunch of games. Basically, they give you a game and you have to test it for like a couple of weeks, and you put in any bugs that you find, and then you're on to the next one. And so you are basically forced to become really deeply familiar with a game in a very short amount of time. And it's usually a game you never would have played otherwise. And oftentimes it's sort of the you end up playing some kind of like knockoffs of games that you actually really love. And it's interesting because normally you would probably just sort of avoid those games. And then when you're testing them, you're required to play them. And it gives you a really interesting view into kind of why the things in the game that you liked work so well, because you see them trying to be replicated in this other game. And when they don't work, you're like, oh, I see the difference. I see why the version that really connects with me, what it has that this doesn't. And, not to be too harsh on a game in that regard, but one of the games that I tested was Mark Echo's Getting Up, Contents Under Pressure, which was like, it felt, playing it very clearly um, kind of spoke to a bunch of the mechanics from the like 3D Prince of Persia games, like Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. It had like clambering on stuff, and then third person fighting, and it had that sort of those component pieces, but you could see like, oh, okay, the climbing and mechanics of this game in comparison to the version that it's referring back to, you can kind of see the differences and compare and contrast, and that's really interesting. One of the only games that I got to be a tester on that is very well known or well recognized is I got to be a tester on Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence, the like special edition they released that had some updates and stuff. Because basically, at one point, one of the pardon me, one of the test leads came around and was like, "Okay, who here has played all the way through Metal Gear Solid 3?" And I had, and put my hands up, and they were like, "All right, you, and you." You're testing Subsistence because you already know how to get through it, so you can like test it more quickly. So that was cool. But one of the interesting things was at that time, the way it worked was you were a temp basically, like you were a contractor and you were being paid by the hour, and they needed, the way that it would work is like there'd be people working there, and they would have a game come in. They would like literally like receive discs of a build of a game, and then they would be like, all right, this game just came in, we need people to start testing it now. And so when business was slow, like around the holidays, when everybody had already sent their games in for cert, and there wasn't much in the office, they would require a certain number of testers to still come in to be there in case they got a project that needed to be tested. But in the case that there wasn't anything for a tester to do, they were basically like, okay, you're here, we're paying you, you need to be at your workstation basically looking like you're doing work. And so if you're on call and you're sitting in your seat and you don't have a game assigned to you, just bring in your own games and play stuff while you wait for an assignment to come in. So I got paid by Sony to play all the way through Resident Evil 4 on the PS2 for the first time, Shadow of the Colossus, The Warriors, the Rockstar game, because there was just downtime where we were waiting for stuff to come in, and so that was my first exposure to some really great games, despite the fact that I wasn't actually assigned to test them.
On that note, let's talk Resident Evil 4, shall we? Let's talk Resident Evil 4 as your favourite game. So, how are you, anyways, with horror, anyways, in terms of games and other forms of entertainment? How do you cope with horror?
I'm really not a big horror like aficionado, especially in movies. I haven't watched a ton of horror movies. I don't like go looking for them.
I'm the same. I can't handle it. I can't hack it.
Yeah. I mean, I think just on some level, like a lot of horror movies, I just don't enjoy very much, because like I get that it's intentionally an unreal situation, and that it's about kind of transgressiveness and being in a space where it's safe to have like horrifying images and experiences and stuff, and for people that are into it, that's the fun of it. But like my brain, just so many horror movies, it seems like, are really about a lot of like just suffering and misery, and people feeling like really scared or in pain or whatever. And like I don't know, something about it's like my brain is like I don't desire to experience that side of humanity more than I need to. I guess. But that's just me.
No, fair enough. Like I can only handle tiny bits of horror, and even then, that's once
Yeah,
in a blue moon. And even then,
yeah,
it's not with movies as such. It's only with games. Like I could count you on one hand the amount of horror games I've played,
yeah,
that I can handle. Like Alan Wake, Resident Evil itself, like Resident Evil 4, like although
yeah.
we'll get to that in itself, and
Right.
Silent Hill 3 and Evil Within, and I even have a copy of Until Dawn that is still yet to be touched. Really,
Yeah.
like
Right.
I can't, and I don't know why I put myself through that, but I just do.
See, yeah, for me, it's not about like it's not the tension or like the scariness that I shy away from because yeah, I played all the way through Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which is like a very kind of like tense, scary game. And I don't know, yeah, I've played multiple. Like I love Silent Hill 2. I've played a lot of Resident Evil games, though some of them are certainly scarier than others. I've played Fatal Frame and other horror games that really are kind of, and there's some games like System Shock 2 and stuff that are hugely important to me, or certain parts of Thief are like really freaky and scary, and that is cool by me. In a lot of cases in films, I guess it's more of just sort of like the empathetic reaction to like, oh man, this person's having such a bad time. I don't like, I don't like it. But I guess that's a personal. I think a lot of it is just like what you can separate from, like what's how much you can separate what you're seeing from like the intended experience that you're having of it.
Like I should admit up front as well. Like I honestly thought the first Bioshock was a horror game initially because like playing the demo, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do
Mhm.
it because the atmosphere was so tense as you were coming in the
Right.
rapture. But
Yeah.
and especially when you're stuck in the lift and there's splicers going all about the place, and I thought, no, I can't handle it. I can't handle this. No. It's only when I've played that when I've managed to convince myself to finish the demo. I thought, I think if I can handle the demo, I can handle the full game fine.
Right.
I could just about handle it. But like even when
Yeah.
you mentioned stuff like System Shock 2, like I had Jordan Thomas on last season talking
Yeah.
about System Shock 2 and how freaked out I would be just playing that, and like it came up in reference to a game that I mentioned beforehand, which isn't meant to be scary in the first place, but yet somehow managed to be scary to me as an 11-year-old. Metal Gear Solid 2,
Really.
especially the third act of that game and the AI kernel.
Right.
That is
Yeah.
not something I should not have been playing as an 11-year-old. Definitely not. But
Yeah.
but even then, you just find those kind of horror tropes in games and think, no, I can't handle this. No,
Yeah.
even in the stuff that you don't associate with horror, like Metal Gear Solid 2. It's
Right.
like, nope, can't, nope, can't
Yeah.
deal with it. Um, so, like you mentioned, like your past experience with Resident Evil itself, like go into a bit more detail about that, like how you first started out with the series.
Well, I the first time that I ever played Resident Evil, and speaking of like generational differences and world differences at the time, so for my I don't know, I guess 15th birthday, something like that. Whenever it was, I had some friends over, and we were nerds, and I rented a PlayStation 1 from Blockbuster. Like you could rent the hardware at the time. You had to, your parents had to put down a deposit on their credit card and so forth. But I rented a PlayStation 1 and rented Resident Evil and this like top-down isometric, super gory action game called Loaded, which looked cool to me. And Loaded, I remember because of that whole because of renting it for my birthday and everything. But Resident Evil was it was a launch title for the PS1, and my first exposure to it was playing it with my friends and kind of having this experience that was so unique to it was so unique in and of itself, both because we all played games on PC, so we weren't unfamiliar with like 3D graphics and FMV cutscenes and stuff like that. But in the form that it was in Resident Evil 1 on a console, coming from this very Japanese point of view as far as like the tone and the production of the video sequences, and having this very slow paced creeping dread not isometric but fixed camera 3D experience was, so many things about it were totally new to exist all in one place, that it was really memorable. And I think it was I was really lucky to basically have gotten to rent that as like the first PlayStation game that I ever played, and to kind of be required to dive into the deep end of just figuring out how to survive in such an unfamiliar kind of game. But it really made me a fan, and I played Resident Evil 2 and 3, and kind of peeked in on the stuff after 3, but didn't really go back to it until Resident Evil 4.
So you didn't play the stuff like 2, 3, or Code Veronica then beforehand, like which came before?
I think I might have played some of Code Veronica after I played 4. It was somewhere in there. I don't know. I played a very small amount of Code Veronica and of like Resident Evil 0 and stuff like that. But I never really got into it. I think that the Resident Evil formula kind of held up less and less well over the iterations, and that's why I think Resident Evil 4 was so crucial, because in so many ways it abandoned the formula and made Resident Evil worth playing kind of on its own merits again.
So with Resident Evil 4 itself, it's very infamous for the fact that it has a lot of re-releases, a lot of versions for it. Like, it's kind of baffling.
Yeah.
Like what version did you play on? Like, you played on PlayStation 2, didn't you?
Yeah, I've actually never, I don't think, played the original GameCube version on GameCube. But I've played almost every other version. I'm the guy that buys every one of those re-releases because I just want Resident Evil 4 to be available to me on every platform that I have.
Oh god, you bought the box edition for the PlayStation 4 recently, didn't you?
I bought the, let's see, so I played it originally on PS2, and then I bought the re-release that they did on Xbox 360, and the re-release they did on Wii, and played all the way through it on that because the pointer controls actually make a ton of sense on the Wii, and the fact that it was a GameCube design in the first place means that it's designed for like one thumbstick, so it actually makes a ton of sense. And then I bought the PC version of the like 360 remaster that they released on Steam maybe like a year or two ago. And then most recently I bought the downloadable version on PS4.
Yes. Jesus, that is a lot to take. Christ, Capcom, check yourself. Like, how many times do you have to put out a game, even if it is as brilliant as it is? He says, he says, knowing that he will buy every version of Metal Gear Solid 3 there is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing, is like I'm totally sympathetic, especially as a game designer, because as backwards compatibility goes away, there's no other way for people to be able to play classic games aside from, hey, hope you still have, a GameCube around and hooked up to your TV, or everybody's playing games on Xbox One and PS4 now. We need to re-release it on that. You know what I mean? Like, it's part of why I love PC gaming, because you can actually load up games from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s and play them. And if they do have problems with like current operating systems, you can either patch it or, you know, like there are fan works like, you know, like DOSBox and Scum VM and stuff like that that basically allow you to play the actual old games on a modern system. But you know, I was the writer and lead designer of the Minerva's Den DLC for BioShock 2, and when that first came out, for a while it looked like it was only going to be on console that it was released, and then it was on Games for Windows Live, which was not good. Basically, like Windows download storefront that had always been really janky and stuff. And I was, you know, it always was sort of a worry to be like, well, you know, when they take down the Xbox 360 and PS3 download store, and when they turn off Games for Windows Live, like this thing that I made just won't be available to people anymore. And so when they removed Games for Windows Live from BioShock 2 and re-released it on Steam, and now like Minerva's Den has a Steam page, or when they did the, you know, the remastered collection for Xbox One and PS4 and PC most recently, that now, you know, somebody can have heard of a thing that you worked on and want to play it and be like, oh, I can actually get it just like on this thing that I have that's what I play games on right now. And that my cat's screaming at me in the background, which you may have heard.
Yes.
I don't know. It's one of those things that it's like, it's kind of a catch-22 where it's like, yeah, man, there's like so many versions of this game. This is kind of ridiculous. But I think there's also some value to just being able to have something be available to people with as little friction as possible. And I wish that backwards compatibility on consoles was more of a thing, but I also get in a lot of ways why that's not just an easy, you know, checkbox to mark off for people that are making and maintaining that hardware and those download platforms and everything. So I don't know. Yeah, it's weird. But I've bought 6 different versions of Resident Evil 4, and I don't plan to stop anytime soon. So bring it on, Capcom. I'm ready for it.
So on that note, like, what would you say is the best version of the game to play?
I think that the Wii version is a really good match because, as noted, you know, the game was originally designed for the GameCube, which only had one thumbstick. You know, it had like the C stick, but it really didn't work like a 2-stick setup. So part of the whole tank controls, you can only aim, you can't move while you're aiming kind of thing was based on being a single stick design. And so the Wii with the single stick nunchuck and the pointer is a super good translation of, okay, you move with one stick, and then when you aim in the game, you're pointing a laser pointer at the world to aim at enemies. And so when you can actually just aim with the Wii remote to aim like you are in the game, it's just like a really good one-to-one match for that input style. People have noted that it makes the game easier, which is true because but that's sort of like, you know, the argument about the original Resident Evil that's like, oh, the controls are clunky and slow, and it actually, you know, makes the game scarier because you can't react quickly to threats and stuff. It's sort of, that's always felt like a kind of dubious argument to me, because it's sort of like saying the controls and camera, which are bad, make the game better. And I feel like there is totally a counter argument that's like, well, you can make the controls good and then make other things be different to make the to make the game still be good. I don't know if that's a great excuse for bad controls. And so I kind of feel the same way about this, where it's like, you know, oh, using the laser pointer makes the game too easy. It's like, yeah, but it was only harder because you were like dragging a laser pointer around with a stick. The fact is that the pointer just makes the inputs more direct for the player. And so if that makes it easier, that's kind of fine. Now I can play the game on a higher difficulty setting without as much trouble, because it's not about the controls getting in the way. It's about me kind of having a more precise way of interacting with the game, which I think is actually a good thing. But you know, I think the versions that I've played the most are the ones that are based on the whatever it was, like 2011-ish era re-releases on the 360, which then was turned into the version that's on Steam now and everything. You know, I do like playing that game with an Xbox controller and having the 2-stick thing and having a familiar set of inputs, and it looks good and runs well and all that kind of stuff. But you know, I'm not. I wouldn't say that I am like super partial to any given one. I haven't gone back to the Wii version, you know, a bunch of times over the years or anything. I've mostly played it on a gamepad on whichever platform is kind of the most accessible to me at the time.
It's just the one that's more convenient to you right then at that moment.
Pretty much. I mean, you know, like the game, I feel like the ports that they do are good. It's like it's the same game. I'm happy to play it on whatever, you know. Like I wouldn't want to play it on a platform like I wouldn't really want to play it on like the PS3, because I've always felt like the PS3 gamepad just didn't have a good feel to it. Like the triggers and stuff, just it didn't feel as satisfying to just use the inputs of the PS3 controller. But the PS4 controller is totally good. And so, you know, right now, if I wanted to play it on my couch, I would play it on my PS4. But, you know, at the end of the day, they've done a good job of keeping the game itself consistent and the experience that it's supposed to be. So I'm pretty happy with most versions of it.
So before we jump into the Resident Evil 4 that came out,
the
Resident Evil 4 that was planned to come out, or there were several Resident Evil 4s planned to come out.
Right.
So the first iteration of Resident Evil 4, that was planned to be directed by Hideki Kamiya, who directed Resident Evil 3, I think?
2.
2.
Oh, wait.
2.
What? I think that Kamiya directed Resident Evil 2. Kamiya... I'm Googling on your show. I believe he was the director of Resident Evil 2, but Shinji Mikami, the creator of the original Resident Evil, was still, I think, heavily involved.
Oh,
yeah.
Now, Kamiya's iteration, he was planning to be a kind of cool, stylish action game, and it wasn't planning to star Leon, but that was canned, in part because it strayed too far from Resident Evil. And what was canned as Resident Evil 4 became Devil May Cry.
Yeah.
So, saying that though, would you have been interested in playing like a Resident Evil 4, which was kind of planned to be a Kamiya-based, cool, stylish action game? Because Kamiya's motif basically at this point is cool, stylish action games, like as we can see from Bayonetta and all that there.
Yeah, and very kind of over the top.
Oh,
and,
definitely.
Very campy, which I think was true of Devil May Cry and its sequels. I mean, I guess I'm pretty open to if if I play it and think it's a great game, like, I'm cool, like there's certain things that when you hear about it up front, you're probably like, well, that doesn't sound like Resident Evil, but maybe, from hearing the pitch for Resident Evil 4, you would feel that way too. And, I think that Resident Evil 4 was a huge departure in a lot of ways, but that doesn't really matter if the game, is like a good experience. So, thinking of the alternate reality where basically instead of Resident Evil 4, there was a Resident Evil that was a whole lot more like Devil May Cry is like a weird reality to think of. But it could have been cool. From my own perspective, I'm glad that there was kind of that split in the timeline there and Devil May Cry got to be its own thing because, I think that the Resident Evil 4 that we got is incredibly crucial and a great design, and represents a lot of the core of what is like central to the thematic experience of a Resident Evil game, while being something new. So it would be a shame if we missed out on that. But it's all kind of theorizing about alternate histories at that point.
Mm.
Sorry, we both got a case of the coughs.
Yes,
We're recording
right.
this in the middle of the winter, and these things happen.
Yes, we do. um, Case in point.
There we go.
There was actually one other iteration before we got to the version that we did get to eventually play on the GameCube.
Yeah.
And that was the version which did star Leon, and it was actually announced before, but it was subsequently canned. But like, it had Leon, but it was more horror focused than it was action focused. Like, it was planned to be like otherworldly, paranormal stuff. Like, you would have to fight suits of armor and ghosts and even living dolls.
Yeah,
and like,
they released. I saw some. I've seen some like prototype footage of that that has been released in the intervening years, and it was more. It was closer to a traditional Resident Evil game. Like, it had fixed camera, I'm pretty sure. And the interesting thing is they used some of the environments from the footage that I saw in the shipping game of Resident Evil 4. There were just different enemies and you navigated differently, and clearly it was, in a lot of ways, a different game, but they still retained some aspects and kind of repurposed stuff that had been built for that into the final version of the game.
So there was, like, I think you mentioned it yourself just then, like, there was traits of the game brought over to the final game, and one of which was the kind of over-the-shoulder camera view. And, like, with Resident Evil 1 through 3, like, and with Code Veronica, actually, you kind of had this fixed view of, seeing, a character like Leon or Chris or Claire or Jill coming down a corridor or whatever, and then all of a sudden, like, a monster pops through the window. Whereas, like, now with Resident Evil 4, you're looking right behind them with that, like, over-the-shoulder camera view. Like, how much of that was a game changer, do you think, towards, not even just Resident Evil, but for action games as a whole? 'Cause, like, it really was a kind of paradigm shift in a way.
Yeah. There were not, I mean, in my awareness of these things, there were not a lot of tight over-the-shoulder, like, third-person shooter kinds of games before Resident Evil 4. It's not like they're, like anything, it's not like there weren't any precedents at all, but this kind of feel of, in a lot of ways, Resident Evil 4, practically, when you look at a screenshot and you think about it, Resident Evil 4 is practically more of a first-person game. Like, if you took a first-person shooter and you just replaced the gun on screen with Leon, that's basically the perspective that you're seeing in Resident Evil 4. So it was this really interesting collision of very direct control, very direct relationship to the environment, while still being a third-person game where you can see your own character, but it was practically more like you were moving yourself through the environment with Leon attached to you than something that we see even today, like Uncharted or whatever, where it's like you are moving the character around the environment and you're also moving the camera around the character, and you really are kind of like driving your character around the environment from the outside, and that very direct connection to Leon as a thing that is always on screen and that is really kind of an extension of your position, I think was really unique. And obviously games like Gears of War, the creators of that series talked very directly about how Resident Evil 4 was a huge point of reference, and they were basically like, we want to take that perspective and that core kind of shooting paradigm and modernize it a little bit for two sticks and make it punchier and more I guess mobile. But I think that Resident Evil 4 was sort of a solution to a problem that they arrived at and that they had a vision for within the development of that game, and it was an example of a new thing that people who are making shooter games could do, and I think it has had a huge influence going forward on the kinds of games that we've played since then.
Like with Resident Evil 4 itself, like it was all kind of. I don't know if I would say it would shy away from more of the horror aspects of the first few games. Like it was still a horror game as such, but like if there was a bigger focus certainly on it being an action game, and I think that was kind of why I was enticed into playing Resident Evil 4. Because like I said, I can't handle horror very well.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said yourself, like you can't handle horror very well. but I think that was a big reason as to why I got into Resident Evil 4, because it focused a lot more on action than horror, and I think that was actually kind of why I enjoyed Resident Evil 5 a lot when other people didn't. Like, did you think that action focus took away a lot of the soul of what made Resident Evil so popular in that it was a horror series, or like did you think like there was a perfect balance of both action and horror in the game?
I think it kind of it moves in and out. That like it's a Resident Evil 4 is a really long game for this kind of game. Like, there's just a lot of levels that you move through. And I think that it has a lot of different tonal aspects to it. Like, it has action, but then it also has some really tense, kind of very, I think, kind of oppressively tense sequences to it. And it also has just, like, campy absurdity in both the story and in some of the mechanics, and it sort of oscillates between all these different things over the course of the game. And I think that when you are first playing the very beginning of the game, it's tense because you don't know what's going to happen and you don't really know how to play the game yet, and then they throw you right into the first village encounter. Very early. They just do some initial kind of tutorial stuff, and then they throw you right into that village encounter, and it's almost guaranteed that you're going to get killed during that thing, and it's almost guaranteed you're going to get killed suddenly by the chainsaw man. And like that shit is so overwhelming in how just sort of desperately you're trying to escape from the situation, and it communicates so clearly that this is a dangerous place and you're probably not prepared for it yet, but you have to get through this really like intense encounter to get to the rest of the game. So like, here you go. Like, tell us when you can survive this, and then you're ready to keep playing. And there's sections later where like there's that one section where you're in those tunnels, and there's basically that one. Like it's sort of like a xenomorph from Alien or a Predator or something like that, but there's that one like big stalking creature that seems almost invincible, and it's a really like survival horror, kind of like a very intense thriller moment of your heart is racing and you're on edge and you're just scared of this thing that it seems like you hardly have any way to even deal with it aside from just trying to get away from it. And I think that balance of saying, yes, it's much easier now to like shoot at enemies and be effective in combat, but there are sequences in the game where that isn't going to help you in a lot of ways, and you're going to be scared and you're going to be like, how can I even survive this? And it's a classic, like creeping horror moment, or a kind of new, oh my God, the whole village is against me. How do I escape from this this crowd of maniacs kind of experience? It's never been in that kind of game at that point. I think that when it brings horror in, it's super effective, and I feel like I guess there's just more variance to what kinds of experiences there are in the game than there had been in prior Resident Evils. But I think that the fact that they still deliver those kinds of like pure survival horror moments throughout the campaign is super effective.
Like with the controls as well, because up until Resident Evil 6 you couldn't move whilst shooting, whereas with 6 you could move, but with 4 you couldn't. Like, you had to stop
Right.
and shoot, and that added as well to that kind of tense tense moment to moment play as well, like
Right.
having to take down enemies and all that there, and like, yeah, that just basically added to it as well.
Yeah. And I think that on the one hand, that is one of those things that was tied to the whole GameCube input device kind of as a starting point, but that it was tied so well into the design of saying you have these two different states and they're totally separate and they're very distinct, and part of your decision making is like, am I moving or am I aiming? And if I'm aiming and guys are getting close to me, I need to switch states and evade and then go back into, it's sort of like being in an aggressive versus an evasive phase that you're under control of. I wouldn't mind as a slight update for dual stick controllers if you could move while aiming, but maybe just like very slowly. Like, I don't really see a reason that you shouldn't just be able to back up very kind of like carefully while you continue to aim. But for me, that would mostly just be a concession to like, well, why can't I do that without hopefully impacting the like core experience too much? But the other side of it is, as soon as you add in that one new thing, even if it seems like, like you hardly, you can move, you're just moving very slowly, so it shouldn't have any impact on anything. Like, it immediately changes the balance of every encounter, and it immediately introduces edge cases, of like, well, what happens if you back into this thing while you're aiming and all that kind of stuff. So, coming from the game development side, while I see something where I'm like, oh, it'd be nice if we had that, if you just threw that in, I also have a total awareness of the fact that anything that seems easy actually is a total, has so many. Any idea that seems easy is just the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is all the other shit that you never imagined that it would cause problems with that now you have to deal with. So, what I mean to say is, Resident Evil 4 is perfect. Don't change anything about it.
You mentioned the absurdity of some of the aspects of the game, like from a story and mechanically, anyways. And when you said that, especially mechanically, there was one thing that immediately popped in my mind, and that was the shopkeeper.
Yeah.
And just how absurd that he is, or what that is, or I don't know how to pronounce it in that way, but that just goes with the absurdity of the game in itself, anyways.
Yeah. The shopkeeper, who just reappears everywhere and is such a strange presence in the game, and kind of lends another element of kind of otherworldliness to this to the setting. And then just like so much of the dialogue between Leon and the other characters and over the radio and everything, and just the very jokey corniness of like goofy one-liners and innuendos and stuff, which is totally at odds with sort of the darkness and tension of being stalked by people with pitchforks and everything. And I think that something that I really appreciate about it is just that the game doesn't take itself more seriously than it needs to, or than it should. Like, I don't think Resident Evil 4 would be better if it was super self-serious about its own story and its own setting. Like, I really love the balance of, okay, trying to acknowledge and go to like the logical conclusion of what this setting and story really means is just ridiculous, but we're not going to back away from it and just be like, it doesn't have a story at all, you just walk forward and shoot enemies. But we're also not going to try to say like, no, this is serious, art. We're gonna like really be about like how important our lore is. They're like, no, we're gonna like acknowledge and invest in the fact that this game has a narrative, and also acknowledge and invest in the fact that it's kind of ridiculous, but the characters aren't aware of it. It's not like self-parody or, you know, like kind of meta fourth wall stuff. Like the characters are all in a world where this stuff that's happening is very important to them, but the creators are kind of like on the same page with the player of, yeah, but this is kind of silly though, which is a really hard line to walk. And I totally appreciate the fact that the game is so true to itself in that way.
So with that in mind, like in playing Resident Evil 4, like how did you find playing as Leon and like as an add-on to that, like accompanying Ashley accompanying Ashley as an accompanying character, like for you, like like playing Resident Evil 4, like certainly for me, like it was one of the first times, like it was basically a kind of hold your kind of like keep an eye on your companion at the same time. As one of those kind of first games that I encountered in that way. Like there's a few others obviously that's just come out since then that kind of stick out for me, like Half-Life 2, although Alex can really, you know, keep an eye out on herself because she's such a great character, but like as well as like things like RE and Half-Life, things like recently as well, like Bioshock Infinite and The Last of Us, and coming to a game that's just come out fairly recently as we're recording this, not even a tale of two humans, but more a human and a thing in The Last Guardian.
Yeah. Well, I think pointing back towards that, I don't know. I haven't looked. I don't know if this is like a thing or not. But as far as The Last Guardian goes, Ico came out a number of years, I guess 3 or 4 years. Yeah, so that came out, 3 or 4 years before Resident Evil 4 did, and I have no idea if it was a direct influence, but I could totally see it being something that the Resident Evil team played, and that could have been part of one of their points of reference, because the relationship with Ashley is different in a lot of ways, mechanically, thematically, everything else. But you're right that there weren't a lot of examples of a kind of meaningful, like mechanically meaningful companion character in this kind of game. And furthermore, in Ico, it was very much an escort quest thing, and like the mechanic of protecting Yorda in combat in Ico is very similar to Resident Evil 4, where it's like they aren't trying to kill her, but they will come up and literally throw her over their shoulder and carry her off to, the whatever, the door, where if you let her get through the door, it's game over. And that's like the exact same mechanic. So, I would be interested to know if those two games are directly in dialogue. But I think that, to your question, I think that, like Ashley as a character and as a concept, is like a little bit problematic in how she's depicted, and it's not like a super elevated kind of perspective on that relationship. But I think that fits within the campiness and the tongue-in-cheek feeling of the overall experience. Like, it's not something that stands out to me as rubbing me the wrong way within the context of the game and the way that it approaches its story and characters. And then mechanically, I think it's a really interesting aspect of the game where, everybody is down on escort quests. People, don't escort quest is kind of a dirty word in general for players and a lot of game designers, but I think there's something that was super valuable in Resident Evil 4 about the sequences where it's like, okay, you don't only have to worry about yourself and your own survival and basically just maintaining your own hit points in these sequences. You have to manage your own, survival, but you also have to be thinking about this other character and where they are and how what you're doing relates to them. And it was just one more thing to manage that added an additional layer of I think, interesting decision making to those encounters in the game. I think some people are not a fan of having to deal with her in in Resident Evil 4, but I'm totally into the sequences where you're like, okay, there's one more thing I have to be thinking about, not just where am I, but where is she, and who's approaching me, and who's approaching her, and how do I juggle those things. I think is something that speaks really well to the core mechanics of a Resident Evil 4 encounter, personally.
So I think it's pretty clear in talking about it for the past hour, like, there is a big, legacy and influence from Resident Evil 4 so many years on. Like the companionship, like we just talked about, like, you can bring that back, even the eco, and how much it's influenced games since its release. Like, you mentioned Gears of War, Last of Us as well is a pretty big inspiration as well. Talk of the influence and legacy RE4's had since its release. Like, it's pretty darn big, like, from a kind of mechanical and story perspective as well, and maybe even in atmosphere as well.
I think atmosphere is a big part of it. For me, Resident Evil 4, personally, as a developer, hasn't had much, I think, direct kind of like visible influence on stuff that I've made, but Resident Evil 1 really has, mostly in as much as the intro lobby, the first room of Resident Evil 1, which is like a big mansion foyer with a big central staircase going up, has appeared in some form or another in a lot of stuff that I've worked on. Like the very first map that I released as an amateur FPS level designer was I was making levels for the first-person shooter Fear, which came out in 2005. It's the Monolith kind of time manipulation slow-mo FPS. So I made a level that was based on that was basically based on Resident Evil conceptually. Like, you start out in a mansion and it has the foyer with the big central staircase, and then you go underground under it, and there's like a lab down there and everything. And then, if you look at the entry hall of Gone Home, it's pretty much the Resident Evil entry hall. And in Minerva's Den, you come in from out on the ocean floor, and then you go in through an airlock and up some stairs and around a thing, and then there's just a big central foyer with big central stairs going up to a landing. There's something for me that just I imprinted, I guess, on that space and that feeling that it gives you of being in this place, and I think that feeling of there being this imposing presence of there's something up there. You know what I mean? So like you were saying about tone and atmosphere, I think there's something that's really connected with me about their approach to an atmosphere that has tension to it, and that it feels like there's something here that is kind of wrong, or that you need to be wary of, or you need to find out about or discover, and just that there's more to uncover in this environment that I keep going back to to that room. We don't really have that in Tacoma because we don't have the scale of spaces where that makes sense to do, I don't think, but I don't know. We'll see if it reappears in the future, I guess.
So as well as Resident Evil 4, Shinji Mikami more or less left Capcom after. Well, he did do Clover Studios with Inaba and Mikami.
Right. And they were published by Capcom, but they were still sort of a separate studio.
Yes. And afterwards, when Clover closed, he went to Platinum and then Tango with Bethesda. Since Resident Evil 4 came out,
did Mikami release anything as the game director at Clover? I know he released Vanquish at Platinum Games.
Yeah, and the Evil Wolfenstein was Tango, and he did what's that Clover? God Hand.
Oh, right, he did God Hand at Clover, which I really love. God Hand is an amazing game, and it's even more Like mechanically, it's even harder to kind of wrap your head around, and tonally, it's even campier and more kind of like out of control. But yeah, I love that game, and it's a crazy follow up to Resident Evil 4 because it's so lo-fi and it's so kind of like intentionally just super hard and not easy to get into. Right. God Hand, Clover, Mikami. Yes. Right.
No, I was just going to say as well, like, even God Hand has one or two references to Resident Evil 4, especially with Mikami, and the fact that he said one time if Resident Evil 4 appeared anywhere else but the GameCube, he would more or less cut his head off or something, and that was made reference to in God Hand as well.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
to my point, like, since like his recent works and all, and his influence on horror and action games since RE4, like, how I'm trying to think of the way to question this as a question, but like, how much of a big impact has he made since Resident Evil 4, in terms of his own actual games? Because like, obviously, The Evil Within is very tonally near enough the spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4 in a way, but you could say the same thing for Shadows of the Damned, which he did with Suda as well.
I think that it's clear that nothing that he's released since Resident Evil 4 has had the kind of, impact that has. I think the games that he's made have been fantastic. I mean, I think that God Hand is great, and I really loved Vanquish, and I thought that it did a lot of interesting things. And Vanquish is a really interesting kind of a response to the response to Resident Evil 4. You know what I mean? Like, it's like Resident Evil 4 was very slow paced and deliberate, and had these very distinct kind of move and aim phases in its controls, and it was sort of all about that. And then other third person games came along and were like, okay, we're going to make Resident Evil 4 more responsive and faster paced and more actiony. And then Vanquish is kind of Mikami saying like, oh, well, if that's what you want, like, you aren't making this fast and crazy enough. Like, this is like, if you're saying Resident Evil 4, but faster and more actiony, how about you literally have rockets on your feet and you literally can't ever stop moving because you'll get killed by stuff? And like, it was a really interesting, I think, version of Mikami saying like, okay, well, let me show you how it's done. If that's what you think, if that's what you think about what I did with Resident Evil 4, how do you like this? You know what I mean? I think that's a really interesting thing to see as sort of, a 10-year dialogue around a game that was released. But it's not like that had the kind of impact that Resident Evil 4 had. And sometimes that's just like a right place, right time, lightning in a bottle thing, where it's sort of like, oh, Mikami happened to be working on the game that he had the ability to solve some problems with it that then were solving problems other people didn't know they had yet, or that gave people new ideas to run with that could turn into other games that you hadn't played before. And sometimes you only get lucky enough to be in that kind of situation once, you know what I mean? And like, that's okay. I have no idea if Mikami will make another game that's like has as much of an impact as Resident Evil 4 did, but like, I think as a creator, a lot of times you're just not in control of that. You know what I mean? It's like, try to do the best job you can, and if you happen to be able to use that to do something that kind of appears at the right point in history to be the thing that people point back to as a big influence, or it's something that changed how people did their work, like, that's awesome. But you don't get to choose that, I think,
So what else did you like about Resident Evil 4 that we've not really touched upon here?
I really like the overall game loop, like the high level game loop of the game. It has a kind of almost RPG-ish overall structure to it, in a way that I think you can see echoes of in stuff like BioShock and other action shooter games with RPG elements, where you as the player explore the environment, get into enemy encounters, find money resources, and also find the different colors of herbs, and then you use those resources to buy new weapons, upgrade those weapons, upgrade them in specific ways that support your playstyle. You decide whether to use the yellow herbs to increase Leon's life bar or increase Ashley's life bar, and there's this really satisfying loop of not just I'm going forward and I'm shooting everything and now I survived the encounter, I'm going to go forward and shoot everything. It's like also you have an inventory, and I love the grid inventory. I'm a huge fan of grid inventories in games in general. I was so happy when the new Deus Ex games came out and they had the grid inventory, because people complain about inventory Tetris, but like I really love a system where it's about how much space you have and how you can arrange that and what it means to put one more thing in your pocket, and it's not just like a weight-based encumbrance thing, and it's not like you can just carry infinite stuff. You have to make choices about, if I'm going to have the infrared scope on my rifle, it takes up 4 inventory slots, and like that's 4 fewer whatever grenades I can carry, and like those kinds of very direct trade-offs, I think, are actual like fun, interesting decisions to be making. So just this idea of it's sort of like you explore the world, you get into encounters, you gather up resources, you decide whether you're going to spend them on making your inventory larger or upgrading your shotgun's reload speed, or it sort of has a very player driven, high level, satisfying loop to it that is not just about making forward progress, but also deciding what you're going to invest in as a player to kind of address later challenges in the way that you want to. And something that's really interesting that I discovered that I think I saw from someone kind of sharing this tip online on GameFAQs or whatever is almost all, or not almost all, but a very large amount of the stuff that you find in the game, the ammo and stuff that you find in the game, comes out of boxes and barrels and is dropped by enemies. And that is all based on a kind of dynamic difficulty algorithm that determines what you need as a player and spawns relevant stuff when you break the barrel or when you kill a guy and he drops something. And so the interesting thing is it's very viable to play the game with a lot of different weapon loadouts and like weird weapon loadouts, because if you don't have a pistol but you have the TMP submachine gun, the game will tend to give you less pistol ammo and give you more TMP ammo, and vice versa. So you can totally do some weird runs and just be like, I think I'm like whatever, shotgun, rifle, and mine thrower only in this game, and it can make it harder or easier, but the game makes it possible, as opposed to if the designers had just decided like, okay, every room you're going to get 12 pistol bullets, then it would be like, okay, so I guess I have to use a pistol to complete this game. But they didn't do that. And it's really interesting to actually push on the boundaries of, okay, well, the game says it's possible for me to do this. Like, I can sell I can sell my shotgun and do a no shotgun run of the game, and it's not just a false choice that isn't supported, but it's a real choice that it might make the game harder, and it might mean I have to make other decisions to account for it, but it's a real choice, not just a like, oh yeah, sure, you can sell your shotgun. Good luck actually making it through the game without it. You know what I mean? And all of that stuff feels very, very satisfying as someone who's interacting with the systems and seeing kind of how robust they really are and how much they kind of deliver on what the systems imply they should be capable of.
What didn't you like about RE4 then?
Let me think. The QTEs are not necessarily the best part of the game, right? Like having to press the right combination of buttons to not die during a during a cutscene is not necessarily like the most enduring aspect of that game, I would say, and also probably the worst influence that it did have on other games that came after it. Like Resident Evil 4 didn't invent QTEs. The Shenmue more or less invented QTEs. I think that's certainly where the term came from. And QTEs in AAA games from the kind of 2006 to present era are not a good legacy. And the thing is, I think that in Resident Evil 4, they're mostly done about as well as they can be, which is to say, like, what they're supposed to communicate is, here's a sudden thing that you have to act fast to, it's like oh shit, you have to, like, have fast reflexes to react to this thing. And in most of the times, I think the QTEs in Resident Evil 4 are kind of the best version of them. But the dangerous thing about introducing something into the dialogue is that if it's something that can really easily be done badly, then you are going to see it be done badly a lot. And I think there's been a lot of bad use of QTEs in the intervening years. So that's a little unfortunate.
So you said earlier that there would be absolutely nothing you would change from Resident Evil 4 because it's perfect, but I'm going to ask you anyways, what would you change from a design perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I would seriously consider how necessary the QTEs are. I do think it would be nice if you could move a little bit while you were aiming. I think there's some stuff about how it tutorializes what you can actually do in the game that could certainly be improved. I think there's some very crucial inputs and strategies that are not very clear unless you kind of get them from a secondary source that's not inside the game. Like they give you the little gameplay manuals as you're starting that kind of show, tell you all the stuff that you can do, but it's easy to not really internalize it. So like stuff like the quick turn mechanic is like super important, and like just the fact that if you stagger an enemy, you can run up to them and do a melee attack, and that it's like super powerful, and that also the knife is really valuable to use like on downed enemies as opposed to just to break boxes or like if you're out of ammo. Like there are these elements of the design that I think that if you see someone play the game who is really good at it, they've internalized all of those things. But some of that is either because you've played it for so many hours that you just sort of stumbled upon it, or because you were looking stuff up online, or your friend told you, or whatever. And so I think that there are certainly ways that the game could show players how to be more effective on its own. I also think that the overall pacing of some parts of the campaign could be tighter. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the encounters on the island when there start being like, mounted machine guns and guys with, like military gear on and stuff like that. It's sort of like, that's not the aspect of the game that really thrills me. I mean, I think that the campaign for an average playthrough is well over 20 hours generally, and it's sort of like, the game could be a little shorter. You know what I mean? I don't think it would lose a lot by tightening up a couple of the areas. But these are all pretty minor things, all things considered. It's sort of talking about tweaks, not like I wish this one thing were fundamentally different or removed or changed.
So with that in mind, like, top 3 Resident Evil games, how would you rate them? Obviously 4 at the top, and then I would assume from there 1 and then Code Veronica by default, because like they're the only ones you've played. Or have you played 5 or 6?
No, I played Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 all the way through. I played Resident Evil 5 a fair amount, maybe like halfway through the campaign or something like that. And I played the demo for Resident Evil 7.
Mm.
And I'm really, really, really interested to see how Resident Evil 7 ends up coming out. That's going to come out in about a month, like after the first of the year, from when we're recording this. And, you know, I don't know if it's going to turn out to be great or not, but they, like Resident Evil 4, have said we need to abandon the formula. We need to think about what is really the heart of Resident Evil and how can we apply that to something that is not a familiar gameplay experience. And I think that that's really bold, and I hope it'll turn out to be like legitimately good and not just interesting. But either way, I'm really looking forward to seeing how that game turns out. I guess for me, yeah, it would be Resident Evil 4, and then 1, and then 2. I guess would probably be my order off the top of my head. But who knows? That could change when Resident Evil 7 is released.
Honorable mentions. Go for it.
I mean, I didn't work on the original Bioshock. I worked on Bioshock 2 and on Infinite, and so I joined that that development team as a fan first and foremost. So Bioshock 1 is definitely on my list. You know, for being a new vision of what the classic immersive sim like System Shock 2 and, you know, Deus Ex and Thief, what those influences kind of mean to bring into a more modern kind of like console-focused action RPG experience, while still, I think, maintaining so much about what makes those games important, and especially what made System Shock 2 so affecting, like you were saying, the tone and the atmosphere and the tension of being in this you know, kind of oppressive place while still relying on those core mechanics of the experience being very player driven and being very much about environmental storytelling, and kind of trusting the player to engage with that stuff and not forcing it upon them, while also establishing an incredibly kind of new feeling and inspiring place and set of characters. You know, Rapture and Andrew Ryan felt so fresh and fully formed when you played that game. So I think that's all super valuable. One of my other favorite games is 30 Flights of Loving by Brendan Chung, Blendo Games, which was a short game released in 2012 on the PC, which is almost entirely wordless, doesn't have any spoken dialogue. It's about 20 minutes to play through it, and it's 100% environmental storytelling in a first-person perspective, but also using the language of film editing and cinematic grammar to cut up the experience into this sort of achronological order, and the player playing through it and being kind of fully engaged with driving what they're seeing on screen at any given point is reconstructing that into a narrative that is sort of implied more than told. And it's so confident and so fully of its own form, and so effective. It's just, it's really powerful. And yeah, you can get that on Steam for, I think, $5. You know, it's really short, and you can play it multiple times, and kind of, it's one of those interesting games where the first time you play through it, you get something out of it and you're like, wow. And then the second time you play through it, you have context for all of the stuff that you see early, and it means even more the second time that you go through it, or the third, which is just really satisfying. I I love Full Throttle, which was a mid-90s LucasArts point-and-click adventure game by Tim Schafer. And for me, that is really also about the world and the characters. Like, it's a world that's almost like our same world with just a little bit of surreality to it, and it's about this sort of very noir-tinged set of characters that are going through a plot of, like, you know, family and corporate intrigue that has a sort of classic noir structure, but the way that those characters are rendered and how you understand them as people, and especially the ending of that game and just how it perfectly encapsulates the impossibility of where the characters kind of wanted things to go in a way that's touching and understated, has been a huge influence on me. So that's a good few runners up.
That is a good list. So top 3 games overall, how would you rank them? Obviously RE4 at the top, but how would you fill out the other 2?
Well, I mean, God, I don't know. I mean, other games that I'm a huge fan of are like Fallout 3. I loved the original Fallout, and I loved how they turned it into a fully explorable world in Fallout 3. I just, like you were saying, I just finished playing The Last Guardian, and that had so much more of an impact on me than really anything that I've played in years, that I was just in awe of that game. And it's been too recently that I finished it, but I can absolutely imagine that sticking around as one of my favorite games in memory, just because it's such an incredible technical achievement, and what it expresses through the story that lives within the mechanics and the experiences that you go through with Trico are just, like, unbelievable. I love Animal Crossing because I like visiting my little village every day. So I don't know. There's this whole, like, I really have a deep appreciation for The Sims because it was such a departure and spoke so directly to people's sort of, like, real lives in a way that was almost a critique of people's own drives. So I don't know. Let's say Resident Evil 4 is at the top, and let's say Fallout 3 is after that, and let's say, yeah, Full Throttle's in there maybe. I don't know. Even choosing Resident Evil 4 as, like, quote unquote my favorite game was really hard. I've got a lot of good arguments for it, but I could argue for other games as well. So I could throw a top 3 out there, but I feel like I would have a hard time quantifying it, you know?
Fair enough.
The game that our studio released most recently is Gone Home, and it's available on Xbox One and PS4 and PC. So, you know, if you want to check that out, hopefully it's available wherever you would like to play it. And then right now, we're working on our new game, which is called Tacoma, which kind of speaks most directly to the System Shock 2 experience, as far as Tacoma takes place on a space station that the crew has been evacuated from, and it's a non-combat story exploration game about you arriving on this space station and trying to figure out what happened to the crew by interacting with these 3D recordings of moments that happened to them before you arrived. So you're kind of moving through the space of the station itself, plus through the timeline of these events that happened before you got there, and you're able to move through the space while echoes of these moments are happening to the characters. And it's another layer of giving you more kind kind of ways to reconstruct a narrative as the player instead of kind of having it handed to you. And we're excited about what we're doing with it. It's coming to PC and Xbox One in 2017. We're still a little ways out, so we don't have a release date or anything. But if you want to find out stuff about that, you can go to Tacoma.game or check out Tacoma Game on Twitter. And if you want to follow me or anything I'm up to, I'm at Fullbright on Twitter. I guess that's pretty much it. I tried to think if there's anything else. I'm like, no, I think it's everything. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Con alegría, con alegría.
Thanks for listening to My Favourite Game. It's worth noting that this episode was first recorded in December of 2016, which may make some of the references in this episode a bit outdated. Nonetheless, most of it still stands, so we're fine. Anyway, next week, Ed Fear on Xenogears. Until next week, bye bye.